Hello, everybody. Happy May Day or International Workers' Day. That's what I'm going to talk about today for a few minutes and then take your comments and questions. So today is a day when we celebrate with marches and rallies or on Zoom calls in this pandemic to lift up working people and their demands for freedom, equality, and justice. That's the red tradition of May Day. But what I want to talk about today is there's also an older green tradition of May Day in which cultures over the world have celebrated spring as it arrives in temperate and Arctic climates, or the wet season when it arrives in tropical climates. And this green tradition of May Day celebrates all that is free and life-giving on the green earth that is our commonwealth and heritage. So I want to talk about how these red and green traditions of May Day are complementary and need each other. So today most people are thinking about the red tradition of May Day, of International Workers' Day. And this red tradition of May Day emerged here in the United States in the 1880s. The immediate impetus was the Haymarket Massacre in 1886, when the workers' movement in Chicago was demonstrating for the 8-hour day. And they had a big demonstration on May 4th, 1886. Went on all day. And then as it was wrapping up, 176 Chicago police attacked about 200 workers who still remained to break it up. And the police fired live ammunition. They killed 4 and wounded 70. And somebody, we don't know who it was, threw a stick of dynamite among the police. And whether that was one of the demonstrators or a provocateur, we just don't know. But in any case, 8 of the labor organizers, of that demonstration, were charged and convicted, and 4 of them ended up being hung to death. And one of those Haymarket martyrs was a man named Albert Parsons, who was a former white Confederate soldier who by that time was married to Lucy Parsons, who was a former slave of African, indigenous, and Mexican descent. And one of the things Albert Parsons said at his trial before he was hung, he asked, "What is socialism or anarchism?" Briefly stated, it is the right of the toilers to free and equal use of the tools of production and the right of the producers to their product. So that was about economic democracy and not being exploited. So Lucy Parsons really pushed the adoption of May Day as International Workers' Day across the United States and Europe. And many workers' organizations supported her call, including the American Federation of Labor, which then urged its adoption by the Second International of Socialist Parties, who adopted it. And so they had the first big May Day demonstrations in 1890, and they were a big success. And it worried establishments all over the world. And here in the United States, on May 1st, 1894, Coxey's army descended on Washington, D.C. in the first mass march on Washington, demanding public work spending to employ the unemployed in the midst of a severe depression. And that prompted Congress and President Grover Cleveland to declare a federal Labor Day holiday in September, not the May Day that people were celebrating around the world and they just marched on Washington about. And it was designed to divide the labor movement. So that's why we have a Labor Day here in the United States in September, even though in most countries, the Labor Day holiday is May Day. So that's the red tradition. Before the red tradition, there was a green tradition. May 1st in Europe was historically the celebration of the return of spring. And most cultures around the world have had some variation to celebrate spring in temperate and Arctic climates, or the rainy season arriving in tropical climates. And except the United States, the American culture has been an exception to that green May Day tradition because we had these damn Puritans as early settlers who banned the holiday as not only pagan but licentious. So we really didn't have much of a green May Day tradition in the United States before, in the aftermath of Haymarket, we initiated the May Day holiday is celebrated around the world, except not officially in our own country. Now, the May Day tradition was spawned by the rise of capitalism because it was undermining the green tradition, undermining the earth, the forests, and so forth that were being chopped down. And, you know, the red tradition developed in response to the rise of capitalism because it was taking people away from the land and their tools of production. So it was called enclosures in England. It's a process that continues to this day, particularly in the global South, but not only there. And landlords and capitalists have increasingly dispossessed working people from their land, their tools of production, and thus control over their means to life. And in the 1500s, this began with the support of the state. Rich landowners began to appropriate and take exclusive ownership of traditional public lands and forests, enclosing them for their own private profit-seeking purposes. And so thus, rural, peasant, and farm communities lost control of the communal use of common fields and forests for grazing animals, hunting game, and gathering food and wood. And, you know, today we see this happening with the devastation of the destruction of rainforests for timber and then turning them into palm oil plantations. And as global corporations are buying up farmland here in the United States as well as the global South and making people that work the land basically tenant farmers rather than independent farmers. Now, the next stage of dispossession developed with the rise of factories with industrial capitalism. And that underpriced the handcrafted products of artisans, who also then became dependent on capitalists for employment in the factories. So in the US, we had this American ideal of Republican liberty grounded in the economic independence of a free citizenry of small farmers and artisans. That was our ideal, but that was giving way and has given way to a more inequitable class society of many workers and increasingly fewer capitalists, alongside a moderately sized middle class of professionals and managers. So working people no longer had their freedom grounded in an economic independence provided by their own land and their own tools. They were now dependent on the capitalists for their means of livelihood. So as working people today, when we cross the threshold of the working place, we enter a dictatorship where we have to work as we're told, as we're directed, and we surrender our political rights to free speech, press, and assembly inside the workplace. And then we receive a fixed wage while the owners take all the additional value that our labor creates. So unlike the farmer or the artisan, who when they sold their products got the full fruit of their labor, we don't. It's called exploitation. And as this situation began to take hold in the 19th century here in the United States, workers called their oppressive and exploited new condition wage slavery. And that was very conscious in comparison to the conditions of enslaved Africans on the southern plantations. And in fact, when the enslaved Africans won their freedom in the Civil War, they resisted going back to work for their former owners because they said they didn't want to be wage slaves. They wanted 40 acres and a mule so they could be independent and free on their own farms. So the workers' movement that arose in response to wage slavery began to organize labor unions and political parties around a program of cooperative production, where the workers would democratically manage their collective work and workers would receive the full fruits of their labor. And what they're thinking is, you know, economic democracy and cooperative production was the only way they could restore their freedom and independence and achieve a decent standard of living under the conditions of large-scale production, the factory system. And it happens that the first political party in the world, the first workers' party in the world, to raise this program of cooperative production, which soon became known by the term socialism, arose here in the United States. The term socialism took hold in the 1830s in the UK and Britain, but in 1829, this working men's party that I'm referring to was formed in Philadelphia and New York City. They were called the Workies. And the Workies elected the president of the Carpenters Union to the State Assembly of New York in that first election. And the author of the Workies platform resolution, a man named Thomas Skidmore, soon penned a book called The Rights of Man to Property. And what he was writing about is, access to your share of property in cooperative production and large-scale production. And the program he advanced is basically the kind of socialism we talk about today. He argued for common ownership of the large-scale means of production, for universal public education, for a debt jubilee, and for land redistribution, so that the farmers would have access to land, and also the former, well, at that time they were still enslaved, because he not only called for the abolition of slavery, but for reparations. This is the book came out, I think, in 1830. So the reparations would be land and a share of the nation's wealth to the former enslaved people to help them get started on their farms. He called for the abolition of private inheritance, with the estates going into a public fund for distribution of a share to each person upon adulthood. I guess that was an early form of a universal basic income. He called for citizenship for American Indians and suffrage and equal rights for women. And with an eye to environmental protection, he decried the destruction of the planet's resources that would inevitably result from capitalism's promotion of the unrestricted use and unlimited private property, because he could see that the factory owners were dumping all that waste, and the environment was endangered. So what we have here is the kind of program the Green Party advocates today, raised 190 years ago here in the United States, and really first here in the United States. The irony is we have such a weak tradition of socialism when actually the first Workers' Party and the first socialistic program came up here in 1829, 1830. So what I want to urge us to think about today, see our task is in the workers' movement as reuniting the green and the red traditions of May Day. That means democratically repossessing the land and the means of production with democratic common ownership of the economy, and of building an ecological socialism that meets the basic needs of all in a sustainable manner. So for the labor movement, that means taking the lead on environmental justice, which has happened. I think the outstanding example is the oil, chemical, and atomic workers and Tony Mazzocchi in the late 1960s through the 1990s, where they pushed for OSHA and got it achieved under the Nixon administration. And then in the 80s, they're thinking, we're the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. We're in the dirtiest industries that there are. We got to transition to clean industries, but we can't just leave our jobs. We got to make money and support our families. So they called for what we today call the just transition. Back then, they called it a super fund for workers. We had a super fund for corporations that couldn't pay for the cleanup of their environmental messes. Workers needed a super fund too to help them make the transition to clean production. So that came out of the labor movement. And, the environmental movement was kind of slow on picking up on that. Not completely. I mean, I was working with oil, chemical, and atomic workers movement as part of the Clamshell Alliance, the Anti-Nuclear Alliance, back in the 1980s on then what we called the Super Fund for Workers. But for the environmental movement, it means understanding that we have to be an environmental justice movement that sees ourselves allied with exploited workers and oppressed groups. And that's because the same capitalist institutions and values that justify the exploitation and oppression of people are the same capitalist institutions and values that justify the exploitation and degradation of nature. So in order to reharmonize society with nature, we have to harmonize human with human. That's how the red and the green traditions come together. So the red tradition of socialism is the way we recover ecological sustainability that the green tradition of May Day rejoiced and sanctified. So it will take the full political and economic democracy of socialism to give people the power to choose ecological balance instead of, as we are now, basically powerless victims of capitalism's competitive structural drive for blind, relentless growth that's devouring the environment and heating up the planet. So in other words, we need the economic democracy of social ownership and economic planning to carry through a program of ecological socialism. So we need the red tradition of socialism that most of us are familiar with to recover the green tradition of ecological sustainability. So that's how I see the green and the red traditions coming together. And the green tradition needs the red tradition to recover the earth that's sustainable. So that's my comments on May Day, and I'll be happy to take people's questions and comments. Tanner's PS 2004, cooperatives, not corrupt unions, capitulating to corrupt corporations. Well, what we really need are unions promoting cooperatives, as they did a lot in the 19th century. Not just the workies and the Working Men's Party. It was part of the Knights of Labor program, the National Labor Union that formed after the Civil War, the populist farmer labor parties, the Greenback Labor Party, the People's Party. And today, we have the steel workers have worked with the Mondragon Co-op in Spain to develop a program of union cooperatives. So if you have a large production unit, you can own it as a cooperative. The workers can own it as a cooperative, and they, elect a board that hires management. You're still going to need a union to deal with, shop floor issues, deal with grievances. So I wouldn't counterpose unions and cooperatives. I would say we need the unions to promote cooperatives. And the steel workers are doing that. We need more of that. Carneal Cash Humphreys, what are your thoughts on the Cuomo situation? Last year when Cuomo was the big hero, I wrote an op-ed about him being an authoritarian technocrat. Because what he did in adopting the budget, and he had these special powers, was pass a law that tripled the number of votes we need as a Green Party to stay on the ballot, double the frequency we need to get them from every 4 years to every 2 years. And then if we lost the ballot because we didn't get enough votes, like happened in 2020, triple the number of signatures we need to get back on the ballot to try to get those votes. So we have to get 45,000 signatures in a 5-week window in 2022. That's Cuomo. He doesn't want the competition. The media narrative was he was mad at the Working Families Party, which is kind of silly because the Working Families Party always put him on the ballot as their candidate in the general election. It was the Green Party that was taking votes from him. I got 5% in 2014. That was the year he wanted to run up the vote, get more votes than his father, Mario Cuomo, ever got as governor, more votes than he got when he was first elected in 2010. He wanted to get ready to run for president, and he got less. And he couldn't take us for granted. So to compete for the votes that we got, he looked at what we were demanding, and he adopted some of those demands, which he had never before, like a ban on fracking, a $15 minimum wage, and paid family leave. So that's Cuomo. He's an opportunist. And now he's in the middle of a couple scandals, one having to do with sending people who were coming out of the hospital infected with COVID back to nursing homes where it spread. And most of our deaths in New York were in those nursing homes. And then misreporting the data on that. So that was the first scandal. And now a number of women have come forward charging him with various forms of sexual harassment. Now, the question is he going to survive? At this point, the public, he's lost some support, but still, most people, majority, think he's doing a good job. And what's the other? Well, he has enough support that he could run again. And we'll have to see if he has a primary challenge in the Democratic Party. Probably will, if he's running. A lot depends on what the state's Attorney General, Tish James, does, because she's investigating. And if she brings charges, then it may be game over for Cuomo. But he may still be there, damaged, but still likely to win the Democratic primary. And then this is a state where the enrollment is 2-to-1 Democratic. So we may still have him for 4 more years. Of course, the Greens will challenge him in the general, but in a winner-take-all plurality election, that's very tough because most progressives and moderates are going to vote for the centrist Cuomo, the corporate Cuomo, rather than the progressive Greens, because the Republican is going to be, scary to those folks. So, that's what it looks like right now with regard to Andrew Cuomo. Scout Trooper 164. What do you consider to be the worst day for Asian Americans? The worst single day, might be when they decided to inter the Japanese Americans during World War II. It might be the immigration law they passed in, I think it was 1925, that basically made it impossible for Asians to immigrate. It might be some of the Chinese exclusion laws that were passed in the late 19th century. It might be some of the recent violence against Asian Americans. I don't know how you rank those terrible things. But I will say that Asian Americans have been the victim of racism all along. And we have this myth of the model minority, when in fact, most Asian Americans are working class people. I got 4 cousins in Hawaii that belong to unions who are mother was Japanese. Filipinos, Vietnamese immigrants, Chinese, Korean immigrants. A lot of them are at the bottom of the income ladder. We have a big problem here with Chinese and other Asian immigrants, along with Latinos or Latinas, who are home health aides in a system where they're required to work when they're taking care of people 24/7. They're required to be there 24 hours, but they can only be paid 13 hours. And there's a lot of wage theft there. We think there's about $1 billion in wage theft in New York. And a lot of those Asian Americans are victims of that wage theft. And so that's been a big fight here to get a law passed where, the victims of wage theft often win in court, but then the companies which have the judgment against them, they basically disappear. And then they reopen up under a new name and you can't collect. So what this law would do is enable when the workers, when they get a judgment, to put a lien on the property of the company that stole their wages until they get paid. So, the recent upsurge in violence against Asian Americans, has to do a lot, I think, with Cuomo calling the pandemic, the Chinese flu or whatever he called it, and the China flu, and sort of gave permission to the racists to act out their violence. But underneath that, there's been discrimination all along. I mean, I saw that coming up in California. A lot of Japanese coming back from the internment camps in the 1950s, but it was extended to other Asians, Filipinos, Chinese, and so forth. And there was an N-word for the Japanese like there was for Black folks. And it was quite openly used back in the 50s and 60s. And I mean, it was so bad, along with police brutality, that some of the members of the Black Panther Party were Japanese Americans, particularly in Seattle. And one of the people in Oakland was very close to the Panthers, Richard Aoki. So this has been a problem all along, and it's time for it to end. Eric Gray, what would be the best way to talk about cooperatives with high school students? Well, I would start with the fact that they may already be a member of a cooperative if they're a member of a credit union or somebody in their family is. Basically, to just show that it's not that alien. Food cooperatives are another one that many people are part of. Many people are part of rural electric cooperatives that were set up in the 1930s when the investor-owned utilities wouldn't build out their grids and distribution networks to rural areas because it wasn't as profitable. I think that's where I'd start. And then I'd talk also about, the difference between being in an economic organization where you get back what you contribute rather than being part of a economic organization where if it's, you go there as a worker, you only get a fixed wage and not the full fruit of your value or the value you create. And if you're a consumer, you got to pay for the product plus profit for the owners. Whereas in a cooperative, it operates at cost. So you only pay what it really costs. And, those are some of the concepts I would, talk to them about and basically say, would you rather work for yourself in cooperation with other people or have a boss telling you what to do all day? Those are some of the things I would talk to high school students or anybody really about cooperatives. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think the chances that the U.S. will be turning their attention to China militarily? Well, unfortunately, they already are. And we're engaged in these games of chicken in the South China Sea and the straits between mainland China and Taiwan. And these are problems that require diplomacy and agreements, treaties, and so forth. If we try to resolve them by war, it could be the last war, a nuclear war. So we have pivoted toward Asia in our policy. We are regarding China as a competitor for being the top dog, rather than seeing them as a country that is, developed economically, and in cooperation, we could, help the poorer countries of the world and deal with the climate crisis and scale back and then get rid of nuclear weapons. So rather than regarding China as a competitor for, a threat to our top position in the global system, we should say, congratulations, let's be partners. That's not going to be easy. China's very authoritarian, not democratic, and repressive in a lot of respects. And I think we should raise those issues, but not in a way that links their changing their behavior on those issues to dealing with these other issues we got to deal with, like keeping the peace, ending the nuclear arms race, and climate change. So I think the saber rattling, it actually doesn't help human rights in China, because the more we saber rattle, the more it justifies the nationalist, repressive narrative of the Chinese ruling class against their own people, because they say, hey, we're under attack. They should see the United States as not attacking them, raising concerns about human rights and saying, we got to work on these other issues. For example, China, which is now the biggest carbon emitter, doesn't plan to be carbon neutral till 2060. They don't plan to peak their emissions. I think it's 2030. That's too late for the climate. So, we should be working with China to help them, as well as ourselves, reduce their emissions. And then there's also the question of the climate debt that the developed countries owe to the global South primarily. The United States owes the most, We've emitted 25% of all carbon emissions since the industrial era began. China isn't there yet. They're catching up. But now both capitalists in the United States and China are buying up agricultural land in Africa and Latin America, dispossessing the native peoples of those countries from owning and working their own land and integrating them into centralized corporate structures. So, both the United States and China need to find a way to deal with this climate debt, which involves not just, paying them cash, for example, in Brazil, not to destroy more rainforests, and compensating for the foreign exchange they're not going to get because they're not selling those products, but also reforesting the whole planet to the forests we had when the industrial era, and even before that, the agricultural era began. I forget the figure. It's like a half of the world's original forests are cut down. That's a lot of carbon we can bring out of the atmosphere back into the biosphere by reforesting. And we're running out of time to do that. I just wrote an article on this, critiquing Biden's climate plan. And one of the things I pointed out was that there was a study that said if we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures, a lot of areas that were once forested will be too hot to reforest. So we're losing the opportunity to do reforestation if we let the planet get much hotter. So these are things that, we should be talking to China about working together on, rather than, us, putting massive deployments of military forces, right on their border, the ocean to the west. And then we got bases in Korea, and we did in Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, that's within striking distance of China. So, they feel encircled. We should not give them that feeling. We should, because they're not threatening, our homeland, our territory. There's no way, except with nuclear weapons, they can. So those are some of my thoughts. And to militarize the problems makes them worse. It's going to require diplomacy and politics to make things better. Rob D. Rich, Lucy Parsons being an anarchist, where do you find left unity with electoral leftists and anarcho-communists? Well, actually, the anarchists in the 19th century were not opposed to running their people in elections for union office, for municipal office. I could dig up a quote for you from Bakunin's encouraging an Italian anarchist to run for the national legislature of Italy. So I don't, some anarchists write off elections, but, how do they choose people who take responsible positions in their own organizations if they have them? I mean, anarchists used to have them. And now some of the anarchists around today seem to think being disorganized is anarchism, which it wasn't. Anarchism was the libertarian wing of socialism. And they were skeptical of Marx and Engels, who said we have to seize the state, centralize power, suppress the counter-revolution, and then the state will wither away. The anarchists were worried that a bureaucratic elite would take power and they would rule. And that was a pretty prescient prediction. So I think, anarchists particularly should be involved in municipal elections where we can change city and town charters to structure a grassroots democracy, a federation of citizen assemblies that would govern cities and towns, so that the city councils weren't representative bodies that make decisions on behalf of the people, but are delegated bodies that make decisions that are decided at the level of direct democracy in the citizen assembly, like a New England town meeting. So, and I'm not sure what Lucy Parsons' position was on elections. I do know that she was very much part of the labor movement, and think she lived to almost be 100 years old. She was a figure at demonstrations all over the country for the rest of her life. This is Santino Musto. My question is, what separates green socialists from democratic socialists? Well, I would say green socialists are democratic socialists, but we call for a socialism that plans production so that everybody's basic needs are met, but within ecological limits. Traditionally, socialism in the 19th century, most of the 20th century, they were trying to solve the problem of poverty by increasing production. So they often argued we can increase production faster under socialism than under capitalism. We won't have depressions. We can prioritize, where production and what is produced and solve the problem of poverty. Today, the problem is we're not productive enough. We're plenty productive. Now the problem is, how do we design our productive systems so they are in harmony with nature, they're sustainable, and they don't exceed ecological limits. So I think when we talk about green socialism, we prioritize the ecological question more than traditional democratic socialists did. And but we believe in democracy. I mean, that's not a question. Eric Gray, how would you explain eco-socialism and the Green New Deal to conservatives in Florida? I got to dig this up. I wrote an article when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took over Congress in 1994 it's called Co-ops for Conservatives. And the thing that co-ops do is advance some of the values that conservatives say they support, like being, educated, competent, responsible. Because if you're in a worker cooperative, you're not just there to do what you're told and get your wage. You're there to make sure the cooperative runs right. And if it's a small cooperative, you got to help with the management. So you got to understand bookkeeping and, budgeting and being efficient in doing the production. So the kind of things conservatives would say, private property, private enterprise, the virtues they advance are advanced through cooperatives. So that's one argument I would make with conservatives. And I'm talking about traditional conservatives. I mean, one thing we got to understand is that the Republican Party today is not a conservative party. It's an extremist, basically fascistic party that's mobilizing people around racism, nativism, and an anti-scientific irrationalism that promotes conspiracies and says COVID and climate are hoaxes that are perpetrated by self-serving elites. I mean, they are just out of touch with reality. They're not conservatives, they're extremists. But so that's when you say conservative, I'm thinking of people that are traditional conservatives. And when you do polling, people that call themselves conservative, they support a job guarantee. That's part of the Green New Deal. They support Medicare for all. That's part of the Green New Deal. They do want to address climate. The climate deniers are a minority in our society. And a lot of the conservatives or Republicans understand that we got a climate problem. So then the question is, well, how do you deal with it? And, the Green New Deal is the one we're talking about is on a scale, and you can talk about the science, why we need that scale and speed to address the climate crisis. And then when it comes to ecological socialism, I would say, that's economic democracy so we can be ecological. We can't leave it in the hands of, these giant utilities and Exxon and Chevron and so forth. And most, grassroots conservatives are not fans of big business. So I think, there are ways to have discussions with those folks. The question is, where do you have them? Because unless you've got something going on in the community where you can actually sit down and talk, it's through the media. And what people do there is, short one-upsmanship, on Twitter or, on, TV public affairs programs where they don't really get into much depth. So you can't have that kind of conversation. I think, the way you got to reach conservatives is in your communities as regular folks talking about real issues. And you may be talking about local issues before you get to the bigger questions of system change and a Green New Deal. Revolution Continues blog. How can workers help create universal health care / Medicare for all programs so healthcare isn't connected to their jobs? Well, we need to keep our unions pushing. Some of them are, a lot of them aren't, for a Medicare for all type program, a public health insurance program. Some of the unions regard the health benefits they've negotiated as kind of a reason for their being. But the fact is, if we can get, universal public health care program, that takes negotiating health care off the table. And the company doesn't have to pay for it. We don't have to pay for it in the contract. We'll all pay for it through taxes, but we won't be paying the fees to the private health insurance system. So I think that's an argument we got to make within the labor movement. And then at this point, it doesn't look like we're going to get any movement on Medicare for all from the Biden administration, despite the efforts of Bernie Sanders and some of the other progressive Democrats, and certainly the Republicans. But there are some states where we might could get it, New York being one of them. We have a New York health plan. We got Democratic majorities in both houses and a Democratic governor. And, if the Democrats can't do this, because they always told us we can't get Medicare for all, or what we call the New York health plan, because the Republicans control the state Senate. Well, now they don't. So, this is the year we'll see. They had a chance after they took back the Senate in 2018 in the last session. This is the second session. They've had an opportunity. We're coming out of a pandemic. Cuomo is weak politically. He's opposed to it, but he wants to be popular. If it passes the Assembly and the Senate, he'll probably sign it. He don't want to get in a fight over people's health care. The problem is the health insurance companies, the hospitals, the private hospitals are pouring all kinds of money into the Democrats in the Assembly and Senate. So they may not do it. But I think at the state level, and then we got to get a, what's it called? Exception that you can do under Obamacare. You can have a public health insurance system if it provides the same or better benefits than Obamacare, which this would in New York. So if we get the waiver, that's the word I was looking for. If we get the waiver from Health and Human Services and show how it works in New York, then it can spread to other states and eventually nationally. That's how it developed in Canada for their, what they call Medicare, their single payer system. So two things, we got to push more of our unions to come out for it, and then we got to get some states to adopt it. I think those are the next steps. Scout Trooper 164, what are your recommendations for the Green Party to gain notice for the Green New Deal? Well, the same problem we got gaining notice at all. We just ran a presidential campaign. We were zeroed out by the corporate media as well as most of the independent progressive media. And that's because with an extremist Republican Party with Trump at the head, most progressives as well as moderates didn't want to hear about the Green Party because they just were afraid that votes for us would help Trump. So that brings up the issue of replacing plurality voting and single member winner take all districts with ranked choice voting for both single member executive offices and then multi-member districts for legislative bodies, which would create proportional representation. That would end the marginalization of the Greens, and then we would be heard because we won't be quote unquote spoilers. So that's one thing. In the meantime, I think our strongest suit is locally. In local elections, money doesn't matter so much. It's going out and talking to people and being consistently active in our communities. And we should be saying we need a Green New Deal that is a plan to get to zero emissions as rapidly as possible in our communities. What does it mean for transportation, retrofitting buildings, agriculture if it applies, of course, power production, and then manufacturing. And there's some things we can do locally, a lot of things, but we can't do the whole thing because cities have to balance their budgets. That's just a constitutional requirement in most states, in all the states that I know of. The federal government can go into debt to get things done we need to do. So you put forward a Green New Deal that says, here's what we can do, and here's what we need the feds to fund. And then you've got a local issue where you can talk to people and develop support for the Green New Deal and both make advances locally and create demands upon the federal government. So that's my recommendation. Bring it to your community in a grassroots way and engage people there. Joanna Munley, what do you think of the healthcare system in the United Kingdom? Could this work in the US? Well, the thing I like about the system in the UK is that it's a public health service. It's not just, they didn't just socialize the insurance, but keep the delivery private. So the plan we put forward in our campaign was for a community-controlled national health service. So we'd have locally elected health boards, which they don't have in the UK, that would make sure the administration of this system was responsive to local needs. And then those local boards would elect state and national boards. So the whole system would be responsive. The problem in the UK is that since Thatcher, they've been trying to squeeze money out of the National Health Service. It's been austerity budgets. And then they've, in the name of efficiency, tried to marketize some of the services that the National Health Service provides. And what that gives incentives for is running lean. I mean, we've had that here in New York, where most of our public hospitals have closed. I forget the numbers now, but we've lost like a major portion of our hospital beds, which became a problem when COVID hit. We didn't have enough beds. And some of the other public health systems in other countries like Italy, that was also a problem. So that's what's the problem with the United Kingdom, is they haven't funded it at the level it needs to be funded. And I would say also, it's very top-down bureaucracy. The plan we've proposed is a bottom-up democracy so that the system responds to the consumers, the people. And so I think we're better off with a health service rather than just public health insurance. Back in the 1970s, there was a debate between three models. There was employer mandates, basically Obamacare, that was Nixon's plan. There was national health insurance, socialize the insurance, but leave the delivery private. That was the Kennedy plan. And then there was a bill put forward by Ron Dellums for a community-controlled national health service. That was written by veterans of, forget the name of the group, but they were the medics and doctors that patched up people after they got beat up in civil rights and anti-war demonstrations. And they came up with this community-controlled national health service plan. So some of the critics of the Kennedy plan called the national health insurance the Great Leap Sideways. And they were worried that, okay, you have the government insure everybody, but then the private interests would feed at the public trough, and you'd have a problem with price controls and or escalating prices because they would charge as much as they could from the government. So that was an issue that I think is still an issue with the Medicare for All bills we've seen in Congress. So the National Health Service bill, Dellums put it in there for decades, and then Barbara Lee carried it until Obamacare passed. And then she dropped it. So that National Health Service bill hasn't been in Congress for a decade now. And You wonder where the progressive Democrats are, because it's a much better plan than Medicare for all. They've sort of decided the best we can do is socialize the insurance and leave the delivery private, but that's going to not solve all the problems. So anyway, I think the basic model in the UK is good. It's just not democratic enough and not funded enough. Melissa Maureen, what are your thoughts on starting new unions? I believe there is a great need for a teachers union that includes early childhood educators, infant care through PK. ECE are severely underpaid and undervalued. Many centers either don't offer a health care plan or it's an expensive plan with high copays and deductibles. I've talked about the possibility with coworkers in the past and had no support. This is a really important issue, particularly in light of Biden's American Families Plan. And what they're doing with pre-K and child care is they're talking about public-private partnerships. In other words, the public pays, but it's going to be run by private entities seeking to make money off that. There are no standards for wages. So it's going to be a situation, if it's developed that way, where we're going to need unions. And as far as people being reluctant to get in unions, we kind of have a strange situation. Public opinion polls show that well into the 60% of people would want to be in a union if they could. But then when you actually go and try to organize, people get intimidated by the company. They're afraid the business will shut down, they'll move. They give them a whole spiel about how we're going to take care of you, you don't need the union. And as far as getting people interested in the union, that's really a long-term process, one-on-one, building relationships, talking to people, building a core organizing group, and hopefully having the support of a larger union. But you really got to build that. You don't want to make the drive to get recognition until you got the votes. And that's something that doesn't always happen. A lot of times unions will think it's time to push, they'll push, and they'll not be ready for the vote and the company response. So, but as far as getting reluctant workers, you just got to patiently talk to people, find those people who are interested, form a group, and then just keep talking. And also try to get the support of a union. But those of you working there should set the strategy, because your workplace better than these staffers that parachute in, and they have they got directives from above in their little bureaucracy, and sometimes their judgment is not the best. So you gotta really rely on your own judgment and your own people. Corey Kinservik, has there been any talk within the party to make inroads with the People's Party? I think it varies from place to place. At the national level, their leadership hasn't been interested in talking to us or working with us. But at the local level, including here in New York, we have pretty good relationships. And everybody understands if we're going to get a battle line back for the left, we got to work together. It'd be insane for us to have 2 attempts when the threshold is so high in 2022. So I think we need a united front from below for a mass party of the people. And don't let the leaderships divide us. Tanner PS 2004. We need to get with MIT so we can have Star Trek and a socialist society. I have to admit, I've never really watched Star Trek or anything on TV. I can't sit still and watch. And MIT has a lot of smart people that need to be working on the things we would do in a social society. We need with computers today and the various economic models that we've developed for not for predicting the economy, but for managing companies. I mean, socialist planning, the technical aspects of it are already done within these giant corporations, and also with parts of government like the Pentagon. Although the Pentagon has problems keeping track of all their money, that we know from the audits. But definitely, we need those technical people, to provide the technical work that socialist planning will require. And I just can't comment on Star Trek because I haven't watched it. Scout Trooper 164, what do you consider the 1994 crime bill to also be just as racist to Asians as to Black people? Well, the 1994 crime bill increased the penalties for a lot of crimes, added a bunch of death penalties, and really accelerated the mass incarceration we have. And I think, whether it was more racist to Black or Asian people, I'm trying to think where Asians were targeted for extra profiling more than Black people. And I would say, probably in some communities where Asians particularly are in, farm work, Filipinos, that may be the case. But, in the big city police departments, we have a lot of, documentation of racial profiling of Black people and Latinos, not so much Asians, unless I just haven't seen that. But the crime bill, was repressive for people of all backgrounds. Lee Showron, do you think it's a waste of money what the Republicans are doing in the Arizona recount? I think they should use the money to help us and move on. Yeah, the Republicans, this is all politics. This is all posturing. And it is wasting money. And the Republicans like to talk about being fiscally responsible, but obviously they're not. The top end tax cuts that Trump did, the unlimited money for the military. Republicans under Reagan, under the Bushes, under Trump, were worse at running up deficits than the Democrats. So, yeah, the Republicans it's posturing in politics. It's not really about elections. Scout Trooper 164, are you aware of the GOP trying to destroy protests by allowing murder by self-defense? Yeah, I think that refers to protecting people who run over protesters with their vehicles. I'm aware of that. And, these anti-protest laws that are passing are unconstitutional. And hopefully the judges in these courts, so many of them are conservatives now, appointed by Republicans, but when they were asking for recounts under alleged voter fraud, they threw all that out of court. And these are such clear violations of First Amendment rights that hopefully the courts will rectify this. But yeah, they want to change the subject. A bunch of right wingers stormed the U.S. Capitol and they want to talk about Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And you look at those demonstrations where there was some violence, most of it was initiated by the police and a lot of it by provocateurs, as we found out from investigations. So, yeah, this is just pounding the law and order drum. And the people it appeals to are the people that don't know the people protesting. So they have an image of these people that are scary to them, when in fact, they're not. They shouldn't be. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. We've been going an hour. I appreciate everybody being here. I hope that your May Day, your International Workers' Day, is a good one, and that you'll think about what I said, that we need the red tradition to restore the green tradition. We need to repossess the land and the tools of production in order to have a harmonious relationship with nature. We can't leave it to the capitalists and the capitalist system, which grows like cancer to destroy the ecosystems that support the economy and life. So that was what I was talking about today. If you go to the website, howiehawkins.us, I have an article, goes into great detail on the problems with Biden's climate plan. And it's titled Biden's climate pledge is a promise he cannot keep. He pledged to cut carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. But if you go look at the climate plan that he released on March 31st, there's no way that can happen. No way. And the link is up in the chat. And it's a long article, about 9,000 words. I went in sector by sector, power, transportation, manufacturing, buildings, agriculture. I went into it, he didn't. And then the international dimension and the climate debt. And it, has a critique of the policy framework. The scale is too small. He's not spending enough money. He promised to spend $2 trillion in 4 years on climate in the campaign. Now he's got $2.3 trillion in 8 years, but you break down what he's talking about, it's only about $100 billion a year directed to measures that could reduce climate. So it's a drop in the bucket. For example, he says we're going to retrofit 2 million buildings in 8 years. It's 250,000 buildings a year. There are 120 million buildings in the country. At the rate he's going, it'll take 480 years to retrofit our buildings for clean energy and efficiency. Just not a serious program. So this is a very detailed article, a lot of links in it, so you can follow up on the different analysis and data that I provide. And hopefully it'll be a tool for people to fight on this climate issue. The progressive Democrats are saying, well, we want 10 trillion instead of 2.3 trillion. But their Thrive agenda, which Markey just introduced, is like Biden's. It's basically paying corporations to do the work. They get to decide what and where to build. We can't rely on them. Bernie Sanders had a Green New Deal that put a lot through the public sector with respect to power, transportation, housing, and even land, which I found very interesting. He proposed that farmers who can't afford to stay on the land, you should have community ownership of that land and give them secure tenure so they can stay on the land and do the transition to regenerative organic agriculture. That was very important. And then, of course, we have our 27.5 trillion over 10 years eco-socialist Green New Deal, which we budgeted out sector by sector, what it's going to cost to transform these technologies for zero emissions. So we think that's what we really need. Biden's plan doesn't come anywhere close to that. So anyway, check that article out. Hopefully it will be helpful. And so our hour's up, and I appreciate you listening. And we'll be back Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a good day.